Imagine a young girl, her dreams as delicate as the point shoes she ties with trembling fingers, stepping into a room of mirrors that reflect not just her graceful form, but the shadows of fate she could never foresee. On a crisp November afternoon in 1997, 16-year-old Emma Catherine Walsh disappeared without a trace from the Riverside Dance Academy in suburban Atlanta, leaving behind a void that would haunt her family, her community, and investigators for decades. Her final pirouette echoed in the empty studio, a silent scream that begged the question: how could a talented teenager vanish in broad daylight from a place that should have been her sanctuary? The autumn wind rattled the windows of the Riverside Dance Academy as Emma adjusted her point shoes for what would be her final time. The November afternoon cast long shadows across the hardwood floors of the Brookhaven studio, where she had spent the last 8 years perfecting her craft. Emma's blonde hair was pulled back in the same tight bun her mother had helped her create that morning, her pale blue leotard catching the fading light that streamed through the tall windows facing Peachtree Industrial Boulevard. Mrs. Delqua, the studio's French-born owner and Emma's primary instructor, was running late from her appointment downtown. The other girls in the intermediate class had already left for the day, their mothers picking them up in minivans and sedans that lined the parking lot like a suburban caravan. Emma's mother, Linda Walsh, wouldn't arrive until 6:30, giving her daughter an extra hour to practice the demanding sequence from Giselle that had been troubling her all week. Before we dive deeper into Emma's story, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Where in the world are you watching this from? Whether you're joining us from a bustling city or a quiet small town, your support means everything. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to stay updated on more mysterious cases like this one. Now, let's return to that fateful November evening in 1997. Emma had always been different from the other dancers. While they giggled about boys and weekend plans, she remained focused on the mirror, studying every movement, every extension, every turn. Her dedication had earned her a spot in the Atlanta Ballet's youth program, and scouts from prestigious companies had already expressed interest in her future. At 16, she carried herself with the poise of someone much older, her green eyes holding a seriousness that sometimes worried her parents. The studio felt unusually quiet that afternoon. The building, a converted warehouse in Brookhaven, housed 3 dance studios, a small office, and changing rooms. Emma was alone in Studio B, the largest of the 3 rooms, with its 20-foot ceilings and walls lined with mirrors from floor to ceiling. She had been working on a particularly challenging sequence of grand jetés when she decided to take a break, walking to her dance bag to retrieve her water bottle. According to security footage that would later be analyzed frame by frame, Emma was last seen at 4:47 p.m., moving gracefully across the studio floor. The grainy black and white video showed her executing a series of turns near the back wall, her movements fluid and controlled despite being alone. The camera angle captured about 60% of the studio space, missing the area near the emergency exit and a small alcove where extra bars were stored. When Mrs. Delqua arrived at 5:15 p.m., she found the studio empty. Emma's dance bag remained exactly where she had left it, her street clothes folded neatly inside, her wallet containing $43 still tucked in the front pocket. Her car keys sat on top of her geometry textbook, alongside a half-finished letter to her grandmother in Ohio. The water bottle Emma had been drinking from was found on the floor near the bar, still cold to the touch. The first person Mrs. Delqua called was Linda Walsh. "I'm sure she just stepped out for some air," the instructor said, though her voice carried a tremor of uncertainty. "You know how dedicated Emma is. She probably lost track of time." But as the minutes ticked by and there was no sign of a young dancer, that uncertainty transformed into something darker. Linda Walsh arrived at the studio at exactly 5:52 p.m., her face pale with worry. She was a petite woman with the same green eyes as her daughter, and she moved through the empty studio with the careful precision of someone trying not to disturb a crime scene. "Emma," she called out, her voice echoing off the mirrors. "Emma, honey, are you here?" The search began immediately. Mrs. Delqua checked the other studios in the building's small office, while Linda examined the changing rooms and bathrooms. They looked in every closet, behind every piece of equipment, under the raised platform where the piano sat during recitals. Emma was nowhere to be found. By 6:30 p.m., when Emma should have been in her mother's car heading home for dinner, the Atlanta Police Department had been notified. The responding officers, Detective Ray Castellanos and his partner, Detective Maria Santos, treated the case with the seriousness that missing children's cases demanded. They immediately secured the scene and began interviewing everyone who had been in the building that day. The other dancers in Emma's class had left between 4:15 and 4:30 p.m. Each had been picked up by a parent or older sibling, and all were accounted for. The building's janitor, Harold Pittman, had been cleaning the administrative offices on the first floor and hadn't seen or heard anything unusual. The only other person in the building was Marcus Webb, a pianist who gave lessons in Studio C, but had left at 4 p.m., well before Emma's disappearance. Detective Castellanos was a veteran of the Atlanta PD with 15 years of experience. But missing children cases always affected him deeply. He had 2 daughters of his own, both younger than Emma, and he understood the paralyzing fear that gripped parents when their child simply vanished. As he walked through the dance studio that first night, taking photographs and collecting evidence, he made a silent promise to Linda Walsh that he would find her daughter. The initial investigation focused on the building's security. The Riverside Dance Academy had installed a basic security system in 1995 after a series of break-ins in the area. The system included cameras in the main hallway, the front entrance, and 2 of the 3 studios. Studio B, where Emma had been practicing, was covered by 1 camera, but it had a significant blind spot near the emergency exit. That emergency exit became the focal point of the investigation. The door led to a narrow alley behind the building, where a dumpster and several parking spaces were hidden from the main road. The door was equipped with an emergency release that would trigger an alarm if opened from the inside, but the alarm system showed no record of activation that afternoon. However, Detective Santos discovered that the door could be opened from the outside without triggering the alarm, a flaw in the system that the building's management had been unaware of. The alley itself yielded few clues. Tire tracks in the gravel were too degraded to provide meaningful information, and there were no witnesses to any unusual activity. The businesses on either side of the dance academy, a dry cleaner and a small accounting firm, had closed by 4 p.m., their employees gone for the day. As word of Emma's disappearance spread through the Brookhaven community, volunteers began organizing search parties. Linda and her husband, Robert Walsh, a soft-spoken accountant who worked downtown, found themselves at the center of a growing effort to find their daughter. Friends from Emma's high school, fellow dancers, and complete strangers who had simply heard about the case joined the search. The searches covered a 20-mile radius around the dance academy, focusing on wooded areas, abandoned buildings, and anywhere a 16-year-old girl might be held against her will. Bloodhounds were brought in to follow Emma's scent, but the trail went cold at the alley behind the building, suggesting she had been taken away in a vehicle. The media attention began almost immediately. Emma's story had all the elements that captured public interest: a beautiful, talented teenager, a mysterious disappearance from what should have been a safe environment, and a family desperate for answers. Local news stations picked up the story first, followed by regional outlets and eventually national networks. Emma's senior portrait, a professional photograph taken just 2 months earlier, showing her in her ballet attire with her hair in a perfect bun and a serene smile on her face, became an image burned into the collective consciousness of Atlanta. Tips poured in from across the southeast. Someone thought they saw a girl matching Emma's description at a gas station in Montgomery. Another caller reported a suspicious van in the area around the time of her disappearance. Each lead was investigated thoroughly, but none provided the breakthrough that detectives Castellanos and Santos desperately needed. The Walsh family's life became a nightmare of waiting and hoping. Robert took leave from his accounting firm to focus on the search efforts, while Linda struggled to maintain some sense of normalcy for Emma's younger brother, 12-year-old David. The boy had idolized his older sister, often bragging to his friends about her dancing accomplishments and her plans to join a professional ballet company after graduation. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, the investigation took a disturbing turn. A background check on Marcus Webb, the piano instructor who had been in the building that afternoon, revealed an arrest record from his previous home in Jacksonville, Florida. In 1994, he had been charged with inappropriate contact with a minor student, though the charges were later dropped when the family moved out of state and declined to pursue the case. Webb became the primary suspect almost overnight. He was brought in for questioning. His apartment was searched, and his movements on November 18, 1997, were scrutinized down to the minute. However, the investigation into Webb ultimately proved fruitless. Multiple witnesses confirmed his alibi. He had gone directly from the dance academy to a music store in Buckhead, where he spent over an hour selecting sheet music for his students. Store employees remembered him clearly, and credit card records confirmed his presence there from 4:23 to 5:31 p.m. The case began to consume Detective Castellanos. He worked 16-hour days, following every lead, no matter how unlikely. He studied the security footage hundreds of times, looking for anything he might have missed. He interviewed and re-interviewed everyone who had been in the building that day, hoping to shake loose some overlooked detail. But as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring, Emma Walsh remained missing. The dance academy struggled to maintain its enrollment as parents became fearful of leaving their children in what had once seemed like a safe environment. Mrs. Delqua, devastated by the loss of her most promising student and racked with guilt over leaving Emma alone that day, considered closing the studio entirely. Only the support of loyal families and her determination to honor Emma's memory kept the doors open. By the summer of 1998, the active investigation had been scaled back. Though the case remained officially open, Detective Castellanos was reassigned to other cases, though he continued to follow up on leads related to Emma's disappearance. The reward fund established by the Walsh family and local businesses had grown to over $50,000, but remained unclaimed. The Riverside Dance Academy underwent significant changes in the wake of Emma's disappearance. New security systems were installed. Policies were established requiring that no student ever be left alone in the building, and the emergency exit was modified to ensure it could not be opened from the outside without triggering an alarm. But these changes fell hollow to everyone who had known Emma, like locking the barn door after the horse had already escaped. Linda Walsh aged years in the months following her daughter's disappearance. Her once vibrant smile became rare, reserved for moments when she needed to comfort David or speak with reporters about keeping Emma's case in the public eye. Robert threw himself into his work with an intensity that worried his remaining family members, often staying at the office late into the evening rather than coming home to a house that felt empty without Emma's presence. The community's response was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. A scholarship fund was established in Emma's name at her high school for students pursuing dance education. The local ballet company dedicated their spring performance to her memory. A small memorial garden was planted in the park where Emma used to jog on her rest day from dance, featuring a bench where people could sit and remember the promising young woman who had vanished without a trace. As 1997 became 1998 and 1998 became 1999, Emma's case joined the growing file of cold cases in the Atlanta Police Department. New detectives were assigned to review the evidence periodically, but without fresh leads or new technology, the investigation remained stalled. The security footage from that November afternoon had been enhanced and analyzed by FBI specialists, but it revealed nothing more than what had been seen in the first days after Emma's disappearance. The turn of the millennium brought new hope in the form of advancing forensic technology, but also the sobering realization that Emma had been missing for over 2 years. Linda Walsh refused to have a memorial service, insisting that her daughter was still alive somewhere, waiting to be found. This conviction sustained her through the darkest moments, though friends and family worried about her inability to process the grief of her loss. Detective Castellanos, now working other cases but never forgetting Emma, would sometimes drive by the dance academy on his way home from work. The building had changed hands twice since 1997, and it now housed a martial arts studio and a children's tutoring center, but he still remembered exactly how it had looked that November evening when he first walked through those doors, trying to piece together how a talented 16-year-old could simply vanish in the span of 28 minutes. The case generated several theories over the years. Some investigators believed Emma had been abducted by someone who had been watching her, studying her routine and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Others thought it might have been a crime of opportunity, someone who happened to be in the area and saw a vulnerable teenage girl alone. The most disturbing theory suggested that Emma had been targeted specifically because of her talent and beauty, possibly by someone involved in human trafficking. Robert Walsh hired private investigators twice in the first 5 years after Emma's disappearance. The first, a former FBI agent named Thomas Crawford, spent 8 months reviewing the case and conducting his own interviews. He came to the same conclusion as the police. Emma had most likely been abducted through the emergency exit by someone who knew her routine and had planned the crime carefully. The second investigator, Patricia Kowalski, focused on the possibility that Emma had run away. But this theory was quickly dismissed when a thorough examination of her life revealed no evidence of depression, family problems, or romantic relationships that might have motivated her to leave voluntarily. As the years passed, Emma's case was featured on several national television programs dedicated to unsolved mysteries. Each appearance brought a new wave of tips and potential leads, but none led to any significant breakthroughs. The age progression photographs created by forensic artists showed what Emma might look like as she entered her 20s, then her 30s. But these images felt like abstract art to her family, glimpses of a future that might never exist. The Dance Academy building changed hands again in 2003, becoming a yoga studio and meditation center. The new owners were unaware of its history when they first signed the lease, but they quickly learned about Emma's disappearance when longtime neighborhood residents shared the story. Rather than being deterred, they embraced the building's history, dedicating a small corner of the main studio to Emma's memory with a framed photograph and a simple plaque that read, "In memory of Emma Walsh. May her spirit continue to dance." Linda Walsh visited this memorial regularly, especially on significant dates: Emma's birthday, the anniversary of her disappearance, and holidays, when the family felt her absence most acutely. She would sit quietly in the space where her daughter had last been seen, sometimes bringing fresh flowers or a new photo to add to the small shrine that had developed over time. The current owners of the space, understanding the significance, never asked her to leave and often found small tokens left by other visitors who remembered Emma or had learned her story. By 2010, 13 years after Emma's disappearance, the original detectives assigned to her case had either retired or been transferred to other departments. Detective Castellanos, now a sergeant, had moved to the Cold Case Division, where he periodically reviewed Emma's file along with dozens of others. Advances in DNA technology had provided new hope for solving older cases, but Emma's case lacked the physical evidence needed to benefit from these improvements. The Walsh family had settled into a new kind of normal, one defined by the absence of their daughter and sister. David had graduated from high school and college, eventually becoming a teacher. He often spoke about Emma to his students, shared her story as a way of keeping her memory alive, and emphasizing the importance of safety and looking out for one another. Robert had returned to his accounting practice, but remained involved in organizations dedicated to missing children. Linda had become an advocate for families of missing persons, using her experience to help others navigate the complex emotional and practical challenges of having a loved one disappear. The yoga studio that occupied Emma's former dance space closed in 2015, a victim of changing neighborhood demographics and increased commercial rents. For 2 years, the building sat empty, its windows covered with brown paper, and for lease signs that faded in the Georgia sun. Local residents, particularly those who remembered Emma, felt unsettled by the building's abandonment. It seemed wrong that the space where such a vibrant young woman had spent her final known moments should be left to decay. In 2017, exactly 20 years after Emma's disappearance, the building was purchased by a developer who planned to demolish it and construct modern office space. The announcement sparked a small but passionate campaign by community members who felt the building should be preserved as a memorial to Emma. Linda Walsh, now in her late 50s with gray threading through her hair, led the effort with quiet determination. She organized petition drives, attended city council meetings, and spoke with local media about the importance of maintaining some connection to her daughter's story. The demolition was delayed for several months while the city considered various proposals for the site. During this time, the developer allowed Linda Walsh and other community members to hold a memorial service in the empty building. Nearly 200 people attended the ceremony, including former students from the Dance Academy, investigating officers, and residents who had never met Emma but had been touched by her story. The service was both a celebration of Emma's life and a recognition that she might never be found. As the crowd gathered in what had once been Studio B, Linda Walsh stood in the spot where her daughter had last been seen on the security cameras. She spoke about Emma's dreams, her dedication, and the hole her disappearance had left in all their lives. "Emma loved this place," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the empty space. She felt safe here. She felt like she could become the dancer she was meant to be. Even though we don't know what happened to her, I know she will want her story to help protect other young people, to remind all of us to look out for each other. The memorial service generated renewed media interest in Emma's case, leading to several new tips and renewed attention from cold case investigators. One tip seemed particularly promising. A woman in Tennessee claimed her former neighbor had spoken about the dancer girl in Georgia in ways that suggested inside knowledge of the crime. However, when investigators followed up, they discovered the man had died 3 years earlier, taking any secrets he might have held to his grave. The building was finally demolished in early 2018, making way for a modern office complex. The developer, moved by the community's attachment to the site and Emma's story, agreed to include a small memorial garden in the building's landscaping plan. The garden featured a bronze plaque with Emma's photograph and a brief inscription about her life and disappearance, ensuring that future tenants and visitors would know the significance of the location. As Emma's case entered its third decade without resolution, it became part of the local folklore in Brookhaven and the greater Atlanta area. High school students researching unsolved crimes for class projects frequently chose Emma's story. True crime podcasts and YouTube channels revisited the case regularly, bringing it to the attention of new audiences who might have information or different perspectives on the evidence. The Walsh family's advocacy work had expanded beyond Emma's case to support other families dealing with missing loved ones. They established a nonprofit organization that provided resources, counseling, and practical assistance to families navigating the complex systems involved in missing persons investigations. The organization, called the Emma Walsh Foundation, helped dozens of families over the years, turning the family's tragedy into a source of support for others. Detective Castellanos, now approaching retirement, still kept Emma's case file on his desk. He had been promoted to lieutenant and spent most of his time on administrative duties. But Emma's case remained his white whale, the one investigation that had shaped his career and his understanding of how quickly a person could vanish from existence. He attended the Emma Walsh Foundation's annual fundraising dinner every year, always hoping that this would be the year someone would come forward with the information needed to solve the case. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic brought unexpected changes to many aspects of society, including cold case investigations. With court proceedings delayed and many investigative activities curtailed, some departments used the time to digitize old files and review cases with fresh eyes. Emma's case was among those selected for renewed attention, with a team of younger detectives applying contemporary investigative techniques to the decades-old evidence. One development that emerged from this review was a more detailed analysis of the timeline on the day Emma disappeared. Using enhanced digital techniques, investigators were able to extract slightly more information from the security footage, identify what appeared to be a shadow moving across the blind spot area of Studio B at approximately 4:52 p.m. This shadow could have been caused by someone entering through the emergency exit, though it could also have been the result of a passing cloud or vehicle outside the building. The discovery of this shadow led to renewed canvassing of the neighborhood, with investigators interviewing longtime residents who might have new memories about that November day in 1997. Most of the original witnesses had moved away or passed away in the intervening years, but a few elderly residents still live in the area and were able to provide additional context about the neighborhood's character and activity patterns during the late 1990s. One particularly intriguing interview was with Margaret Fulton, an elderly woman who had lived across the street from the dance academy since 1985. Mrs. Fulton, now in her 80s and suffering from early-stage dementia, had been interviewed briefly in 1997, but had not been considered a key witness since she hadn't seen anything directly related to Emma's disappearance. However, during the 2020 interview, she mentioned something that had not appeared in the original police reports. "There was always that man," she said, her voice wavering but her memory surprisingly clear about certain details. "He would park down the street and watch the girls go in and out of the dance place. I told my husband about it, but he said I was being paranoid. This was before Emma disappeared. You understand? Months before, but I always remembered thinking it was strange. Mrs. Fulton's description of the man was vague, middle-aged, driving a dark-colored sedan, usually present during the afternoon hours when classes were ending. She couldn't recall specific dates or provide a detailed physical description, but her account suggested that someone had been conducting surveillance on the dance academy for an extended period before Emma's disappearance. This supported the theory that Emma had been targeted specifically rather than being the victim of a random crime. Investigators attempted to cross-reference Mrs. Fulton's account with other evidence from the case, including registered sex offenders in the area and reports of suspicious activity. But the passage of time made verification difficult. However, her statement was included in an updated case summary that was distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the Southeast in hopes that it might generate new leads or connect Emma's case to other unsolved crimes. The renewed attention on Emma's case in 2020 and 2021 led to an inclusion in a Netflix documentary series about cold cases. The episode featuring Emma's story aired in the summer of 2021 and generated thousands of tips from viewers around the world. Most of these tips proved to be irrelevant or based on mistaken identity, but several dozen were considered worthy of investigation. One tip that particularly intrigued investigators came from a woman in North Carolina who claimed her deceased father had made suspicious comments about Emma's case. According to the caller, her father had been working construction jobs in the Atlanta area during the late 1990s and had made several references to knowing what happened to that dancing girl during conversations with family members. The woman had not come forward earlier because she feared her father, who had a history of violence, but felt compelled to speak after seeing Emma's story on television. The investigation into this tip revealed that the woman's father, Dennis Kovalik, had indeed worked construction in the Atlanta area during 1997 and had a criminal record that included assault and burglary charges. However, he had died in 2015, and investigators were unable to find physical evidence linking him to Emma's disappearance. The timing of his work in Atlanta did coincide with Emma's disappearance, and he had no verifiable alibi for November 18, 1997. But without additional evidence, the connection remained speculative. As 2022 approached, marking 25 years since Emma's disappearance, the case remained officially open but practically dormant. The original investigators had retired. The physical evidence had been tested using every available forensic technique, and the leads had been exhausted. Linda Walsh, now approaching 60, continued her advocacy work, but had privately begun to accept that she might never know what happened to her daughter. The site of the former dance academy had been transformed into a successful office building with a thriving tenant base. The memorial garden dedicated to Emma was well maintained and frequently visited, but many of the building's occupants were unaware of the tragedy that had occurred on their building site decades earlier. Life had moved on, as inevitably does, but Emma's story remained frozen in time on that November afternoon in 1997. In the spring of 2023, the office building that had replaced the dance academy underwent renovation of its ground floor to accommodate a new tenant. The construction work required excavation for new utility lines, and workers were digging near the area that had once been the emergency exit of Studio B. On a mild Tuesday morning in April, a construction worker named Miguel Hernandez was operating a small excavator when his bucket struck something that wasn't dirt or rock. Miguel shut down the machine and called his supervisor, thinking he had hit a water or gas line. When the supervisor, James Tucker, arrived to investigate, they discovered that the excavator had unearthed a metal container, specifically a small fireproof safe that appeared to have been buried for many years. The safe was approximately 12 inches square and 6 inches deep, its once black paint now faded and chipped from its time underground. James Tucker immediately recognized the potential significance of the discovery. He'd lived in the area for over 30 years and remembered Emma Walsh's disappearance clearly. He made a decision to contact the police rather than attempting to open the safe himself, understanding that if it was related to Emma's case, proper evidence handling would be crucial. Detective Monica Rivera, the current head of the cold case unit, arrived at the construction site within 2 hours of the call. She was a 12-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department who had inherited Emma's case file when she joined the Cold Case Division in 2019. She had studied the case extensively and had been hoping for exactly this kind of break. New physical evidence that might finally provide answers to the Walsh family's decades-long questions. The safe was carefully excavated from its resting place, approximately 4 feet underground and roughly 15 feet from where the Dance Academy's emergency exit had been located. Its position was consistent with someone having buried it hastily in the narrow alley behind the building, possibly on the night of Emma's disappearance or shortly thereafter. The safe showed signs of having been damaged. Its locking mechanism appeared to have been forced, though it was unclear whether this damage had occurred before or after burial. Detective Rivera contacted Linda Walsh before news of the discovery could leak to the media. The conversation was one of the most difficult of Rivera's career. Linda's voice shook as she listened to details of what had been found, and Rivera could hear 26 years of hope and fear colliding in that single phone call. Does this mean? Linda began to ask, but couldn't finish the question. Rivera assured her that it was too early to know what the safe contained or whether it was related to Emma's case, but that they would know more within days. The safe was transported to the forensics lab, where specialists began the delicate process of opening it without destroying any potential evidence inside. The exterior was photographed extensively and tested for fingerprints, though the years underground had likely compromised any surface evidence. X-ray imaging revealed that the safe contained papers and what appeared to be small objects, but the exact contents couldn't be determined without opening it. On the morning of April 19, 2023, almost exactly 26 years and 5 months after Emma's disappearance, the safe was finally opened. Inside, forensic specialists found a collection of items that sent shockwaves through the investigation team. There were dozens of photographs, some showing the interior of the Dance Academy from angles that suggested they had been taken covertly. There were detailed notes about the schedules and routines of various students, including Emma, and there was a handwritten letter sealed in a plastic bag addressed simply to Emma's mother. Detective Rivera's hand shook slightly as she read the letter for the first time. It was written in block letters, obviously disguised handwriting. Its contents were both a confession and an expression of remorse that had been buried for more than 2 decades. I never meant for it to happen the way it did. I was only supposed to watch her, to take pictures for someone else. But when I saw her alone that day, something changed in my mind. I thought I could talk to her, maybe convince her to come with me willingly, but she fought, and I panicked. It was an accident when she fell and hit her head on the bar. I checked for a pulse, but couldn't find one. I was so scared of going to prison that I panicked and hid her body where no one would ever find it. I've lived with this guilt every day since. I'm sorry to her family. I'm sorry to everyone who searched for her. By the time you read this, I'll probably be dead, but I wanted someone to know the truth about what happened to Emma Walsh. The letter was not signed, but it included details about the Dance Academy's layout and Emma's routine that only someone with inside knowledge could have known. It mentioned the emergency exit, the broken alarm system, and Emma's habit of staying late to practice alone. Most significantly, it referenced a specific injury that Emma had sustained 2 weeks before her disappearance, a minor ankle sprain that she had mentioned only to her family and closest friends at the Dance Academy. Along with the letter, the safe contained photographs that were clearly surveillance images of Emma and other students. The photos had been taken from various locations around the Dance Academy and showed Emma entering and leaving the building, practicing through the windows, and interacting with other students. The level of detail and the extended time frame represented by the photographs suggested that Emma had been stalked for weeks or possibly months before her disappearance. The most disturbing item in the safe was a small notebook filled with handwritten observations about Emma's schedule, her family's routines, and detailed plans of what the writer referred to as the approach. The notebook included maps of the area around the Dance Academy, escape routes, and contingency plans. It was the work of someone who had invested significant time and effort into planning Emma's abduction. Detective Rivera immediately contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to assist with interpreting the evidence and developing a profile of the letter's author. The confession letter suggested that Emma's death had been accidental and that her body had been hidden in a location that the perpetrator believed would never be discovered. This was consistent with the fact that extensive searches in the months and years following Emma's disappearance had never yielded any trace of her remains. The question now became, who had written the letter and buried the safe? The confession indicated that the perpetrator had been hired to conduct surveillance on Emma, suggesting that her abduction might have been part of a larger criminal enterprise. This opened up new avenues of investigation, including the possibility that Emma's case was connected to other disappearances of young women in the Southeast during the late 1990s. Forensic handwriting analysts began comparing the letter and notebook entries to writing samples from known suspects in Emma's case, including Marcus Webb and Dennis Kovalik. Initial analysis suggested that neither man was the author of the confession, meaning that the investigation had been focused on the wrong suspect for over 2 decades. The handwriting exhibited characteristics suggesting that the writer was left-handed, had received at least a high school education, and was likely between 30 and 50 years old at the time the letter was written. DNA extraction from the letter and photographs proved challenging due to the item's age and storage conditions, but forensic specialists were optimistic that some genetic material could be recovered. The plastic bag that protected the letter showed signs of being handled without gloves, and saliva traces from the envelope seal might yield DNA evidence that could be compared to databases of known offenders. The discovery of the safe generated intense media attention, with news outlets from around the country covering the development in Emma's case. The Walsh family requested privacy as they processed this new information, but Linda Walsh did issue a brief statement. After 26 years of not knowing, we finally have some answers about what happened to our daughter. While this doesn't bring Emma back to us, it does provide some closure, and we hope it will help the police find the person responsible for taking her from us. The investigation team began reviewing all physical evidence from Emma's original case file with fresh eyes, looking for connections they might have missed the first time. They also started examining other cold cases from the same time period, searching for similar patterns of surveillance, planning, and execution that might indicate the same perpetrator was responsible for multiple crimes. One case that immediately caught their attention was the 1996 disappearance of a 17-year-old gymnast named Ashley Martinez from a training facility in Birmingham, Alabama. Like Emma, Ashley had been practicing alone when she disappeared, and like Emma's case, there had been reports of a suspicious man watching the gymnasium in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Ashley's case had never been solved, and her body had never been found. Further research revealed 3 additional cases in Georgia, Tennessee, and South Carolina involving the disappearances of young female athletes between 1995 and 1999. In each case, the victim had been alone at their training facility when they vanished, and in each case, there had been reports of surveillance activity in the weeks prior to the disappearance. None of the cases had been connected previously, but the discovery of Emma's confession letter provided a new framework for understanding what might have been a coordinated criminal enterprise targeting young female athletes. The FBI's involvement expanded as investigators began to suspect they were dealing with a serial predator who had operated across multiple states. A task force was formed to coordinate the investigation of all 5 cases, with Detective Rivera serving as a liaison for Emma's case. The task force included representatives from local law enforcement agencies in each jurisdiction, FBI behavioral analysts, and forensic specialists. As summer turned to fall in 2023, the investigation into Emma's case and the related disappearances intensified. The confession letter had provided crucial information about Emma's fate, but it had also opened up a much larger and more complex criminal investigation. The perpetrator's claim that he had been hired to watch Emma suggested the existence of a network of individuals involved in targeting and abducting young women. The handwriting analysis of the confession letter yielded additional clues about its author. The handwriting expert determined that the writer had likely been educated in the southeastern United States based on specific letter formations and writing patterns that were characteristic of regional educational systems. The expert also noted that the handwriting showed signs of stress and urgency, consistent with someone writing under emotional duress. In October 2023, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A retired FBI agent named Robert Chun, who had worked organized crime cases in the Southeast during the 1990s, contacted the task force after seeing news coverage about Emma's case. Chun had maintained files on several criminal enterprises that had operated in the region during that time period, including one group that had been suspected of involvement in human trafficking and the production of illegal pornography. According to Chen's files, This organization had operated under the cover of various legitimate businesses, including talent agencies and modeling scouts. They had targeted young women with athletic or artistic abilities, often conducting extended surveillance before attempting to recruit or abduct their victims. The organization had been the subject of federal investigation in 1998 and 1999, but the case had been closed when several key suspects died or disappeared and witnesses became unavailable. Chen's information provided a new context for understanding Emma's case and the related disappearances. Rather than being random crimes, they might have been coordinated operations conducted by an organized criminal group. This would explain the level of planning evident in Emma's case, as well as the similarities between her disappearance and those of other young female athletes in the region. The task force began reviewing Chen's files and attempting to identify surviving members of the criminal organization. Several names appeared in connection with multiple cases, including a man named Vincent Torino, who had been suspected of recruiting victims for the organization. Torino had died in a car accident in 2001, but investigators were able to obtain DNA samples from his family members for comparison with evidence from Emma's case. As 2024 began, nearly 27 years after Emma's disappearance, the investigation had evolved from a single missing persons case into a complex multi-jurisdictional effort to understand and prosecute a criminal conspiracy that might have claimed dozens of victims. The confession letter found buried behind Emma's dance academy had provided the key that unlocked not just the mystery of her disappearance, but potentially a much larger pattern of crimes that had gone undetected for decades. Detective Rivera, now leading the expanded investigation, often thought about Emma Walsh and the young woman she would have become. At 43, Emma would likely have been married, perhaps with children of her own. She might have become a professional dancer she had dreamed of being, or she might have found other passions and pursuits. Instead, her life had been cut short by someone who had seen her not as a person with dreams and potential, but as a commodity to be exploited. The search for Emma's remained continued, guided by clues and confession letter about the location where her body had been hidden. The letter's author had written that she would never be found, but investigators remain hopeful that advances in ground-penetrating radar and other search technologies might eventually lead them to Emma's final resting place, allowing her family to finally lay her to rest. Linda Walsh, now in her early 60s, had found some measure of peace in finally knowing what had happened to her daughter. The knowledge that Emma's death had been accidental, the result of a panicked criminal rather than a deliberate act of violence, provided some small comfort. More importantly, the investigation that had grown from Emma's case might prevent other families from experiencing the decades of uncertainty and grief that the Walshes had endured. The Emma Walsh Foundation had evolved to support not just families of missing persons, but also efforts to combat human trafficking and the exploitation of vulnerable young people. Linda's advocacy work had taken on new urgency as the scope of the criminal organization that had targeted her daughter became clear. She testified before Congress about the need for better coordination between law enforcement agencies and improved resources for investigating complex criminal conspiracies. In the spring of 2024, exactly 1 year after the discovery of the safe, investigators announced a significant breakthrough in the case. DNA evidence recovered from the confession letter had been matched to a man named William Patterson, who had died in 2019 at the age of 68. Patterson's criminal history included several arrests for stalking and voyeurism, and he had been employed as a private investigator during the 1990s, which would have given him the skills and resources needed to conduct surveillance operations. Patterson's connection to the criminal organization described in Robert Chen's files was confirmed through financial records and witness testimony from surviving family members. He had apparently been paid to conduct surveillance on potential victims, but Emma's case had escalated beyond his original assignment when he decided to approach her directly. His confession letter suggested that he had been consumed by guilt over Emma's accidental death and his decision to hide her body rather than report what had happened. The investigation into Patterson's activities revealed connections to at least 8 other missing persons cases in the Southeast, including the disappearance of Ashley Martinez, the gymnast from Birmingham. In several cases, Patterson had been identified as being in the area around the time of the disappearance, though he had never been considered a suspect because his role in the surveillance phase of the operation had not been understood. With Patterson's death, there could be no criminal prosecution for Emma's murder. But the information he had provided in his confession letter allowed investigators to close several cold cases and provide answers to other families who had been waiting decades for information about their missing loved ones. The criminal organization that had employed Patterson had largely disbanded by the early 2000s, with most of its members either dead or in prison on other charges. The location where Emma's body had been hidden remained a mystery, despite extensive searches guided by clues in Patterson's confession letter. He had written that she was buried, where the water meets the trees, where no one ever goes, which investigators interpreted as a reference to a remote area near a lake or river. Ground-penetrating radar searches of dozens of locations matching this description had not yielded any results, leading some investigators to believe that Patterson might have been deliberately vague to ensure that Emma's remains would never be found. As the investigation wound down in late 2024, Detective Rivera reflected on the case that had defined the latter part of her career. Emma Walsh's disappearance had remained unsolved for 27 years, but the persistence of her family and the dedication of multiple generations of investigators had eventually yielded the truth. The case had also exposed a criminal conspiracy that might otherwise have remained hidden, potentially saving other young women from becoming victims. The dance academy where Emma had spent her final moments had been gone for years, replaced by a modern office building and memorial garden. But Emma's story lived on in the work of the foundation that bore her name, in improved investigative techniques that her case had helped develop, and in the other families who had finally received answers about their own missing loved ones. Linda Walsh continued to visit Emma's memorial garden regularly, often bringing flowers or small mementos to leave at the bronze plaque that commemorated her daughter's life. She had finally achieved some measure of closure, knowing what happened to Emma and understanding that her daughter's death, while tragic and senseless, had not been the result of deliberate cruelty, but rather a crime that had spiraled out of control. The Emma Walsh case became a textbook example of how cold cases could be solved through persistence, technological advancement, and the willingness to look at old evidence in new ways. It was featured in law enforcement training programs and academic courses on criminal investigation, ensuring that future generations of investigators would understand the importance of never giving up on unsolved cases, no matter how much time had passed. As 2025 began, nearly 28 years after Emma's disappearance, her case was officially classified as solved, though her body had never been recovered. The Walsh family held memorial service to mark this milestone, attended by many of the investigators, community members, and advocates who had supported their search for answers over the decades. It was both a celebration of Emma's life and a recognition that justice, while delayed, had finally been achieved. Emma Walsh would have been 44 years old in 2025, possibly a mother herself, perhaps still dancing or teaching others to dance. Instead, she remained forever 16 in the memories of those who knew her, a talented young woman whose dreams had been cut short, but whose story had ultimately helped protect others and bring closure to families across the Southeast. The note found buried behind her dance studio had finally revealed the truth about her disappearance, proving that even after decades, some secrets cannot stay buried forever.